we love each other. Turn to Genesis chapter 39 this morning. As promised, last week we took a look at Joseph's life. We took a look from him getting thrown in the pit all the way to him being in the palace, and we skipped a lot of stuff in between. And so we're going to go back today and look at least part of that story, what happens in between. This is after Joseph is sold into slavery. He finds himself in Potiphar's house, and we're just going to read really the whole passage, and then we'll come back and look at this in Genesis chapter 39, verses 2 through 20. Verse 2 says, the Lord was with Joseph. And I said I was going to read the whole passage, but actually I think I just need to stop right there for a second, because that's a very important phrase. The Lord was with Joseph. Before we get into all the injustices that is going to take place in Joseph's life, we need to set the tone right away by reminding ourselves that the Lord is with Joseph. And you say, well, Pastor, that's great, but Joseph was a man of the Bible, and God loved people in the Bible a whole lot more than he loved me. That's not true. Isaiah 41:10 is a promise for me and you that says, do not fear, for I am with you. Do not fear, for I am with you. And I think we need to wake up every morning and start proclaiming that scripture, right? Today, God, I am not going to fear because you are with me. Regardless of whatever happens in my life today, I know it's going to be okay because you are with me. Let me remind myself that I can make it because you are with me. Now bring on the drama. Now bring on the obstacles. Now bring on the daily struggle. It's okay because God is with me. He is with me. We've already established what is of most importance, and that is the fact that His presence is always there. I don't know about you, but I've seen God provide in my life on countless times. Times that I didn't know how I was going to pay for this or pay for that or do this or do that, and God provided. He has shown Himself as my provider. I've had countless times in my life where there's different pains and illnesses that come on my body and my family's body, and God has brought a healing. So He has shown Himself as my healer. That's two testimonies right there, provision and healing, that we just heard this morning. God has shown Himself as my deliverer. He's shown Himself as my peace. He's shown Himself as my strength. He's shown Himself as my hope. His presence has brought all those things into my life to the point to where I know as long as He's around, I have all those things. I'm okay. There's value in His presence. There's so much value in His presence. So with that, we can have an assurance of faith that His presence is with us. And if we have to face all these things, it's okay. I would hate to have to face all those things and not have an assurance of God's presence in my life. Because then it's just the attacks that you're focusing on. But because He is with us, we know that no weapon that is formed against us will prosper. We know that we can overcome. So we can't just skip over verse 2 like it's some little phrase in the Bible. That's important. Before we get into anything that happens in Joseph's life, the Lord was with Joseph. Now bring on the struggle. So he succeeded, the Bible says, in everything he did as he served in the home of his Egyptian master. Potiphar noticed this, and he realized that the Lord was with Joseph, giving him success in everything he did. This pleased Potiphar. So he soon made Joseph his personal attendant. He put him in charge of his entire household and everything he owned. From the day Joseph was put in charge of his master's household and property, the Lord began to bless Potiphar's household for Joseph's sake. All of his household affairs ran smoothly, and his crops and his livestock flourished. So Potiphar gave Joseph complete administrative responsibility over everything he owned. With Joseph there, he didn't worry about a thing except for what kind of food to eat. Joseph was a very handsome and well-built young man, and Potiphar's wife soon began to look at him lustfully. Come sleep with me, she demanded, but Joseph refused. Look, he told her, my master trusts me with everything in his entire household. No one here has more authority than I do. He has held back nothing from me except for you because you are his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God. She kept putting pressure on Joseph day after day, but he refused to sleep with her, and he kept out of her way as much as possible. Sometimes you just got to stay out of the way, don't you? One day, however, no one else was around, and he went in to do his work. She came and grabbed him by his cloak, demanding, come sleep with me. Joseph tore himself away, but he left his cloak in her hand as he ran from the house. When she saw that she was holding his cloak and he had fled, she called out to her servants. Soon all the men came running. "Look, my husband has brought this Hebrew slave here to make fools of us. He came to my room to rape me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream, he ran outside and got away, but he left his cloak behind with me." Liar, liar, pants on fire. She kept the cloak with her until her husband came home, and then she told him her story. "That Hebrew slave you brought into our house tried to come in and fool around with me, but when I screamed, he ran outside, leaving his cloak with me." Potiphar was furious when he heard his wife's story, and that's exactly what it was about how Joseph treated her. So he took Joseph, and he threw him into the prison where the king's prisoners were held, and there he remained. I'm going to put a title on this message today. If you're taking notes, you could just call it "In the Presence of My Enemies." In the presence of my enemies. So here Joseph did nothing wrong. Absolutely nothing wrong. Falsely accused of a crime that he didn't commit, and now he finds himself in prison. But what I find interesting is what happens in Genesis 39. There's a stark contrast between verse 5 and verse 20. Can we put Genesis 39:5 back on the screen there? Genesis 39:5 says, "From the day Joseph was put in charge of his master's household and property, the Lord began to bless Potiphar's household for Joseph's sake. All of his household affairs ran smoothly, except for the one that his wife tried to have." That was a joke. Get it? That affair didn't go too smooth. Anyways, y'all got an extra hour of sleep, so you can't blame it on being tired this morning. All of his affairs ran smoothly. His crops and his livestock flourished. Things were good in Potiphar's household because of Joseph. Great situation. Verse number 20. Let's look at verse number 20 there. A little bit different. Potiphar took Joseph and threw him in prison where the king's prisoners were held, and there he remained. Wow, what a difference. What a difference. I wonder if there's anybody here this morning who your life has been a blessing to someone else. You've done everything you can to be a blessing to someone else, yet in a moment of misunderstanding, they've forgotten all about the blessings that you brought in their life. They forgot all about the good things that you brought in their life. Here, Joseph goes from being a favored one to really being forsaken. And here Potiphar, in a moment's time, goes from being a friend to being a foe. And it all really happens over a misunderstanding. If only Potiphar would have listened and weighed the evidence, he could have found out the truth. But there was just a big misunderstanding. It was a rumor that led to it, yes, but a misunderstanding caused all this to change in Joseph's life. Proverbs 4:7 tells us this. It says, "The beginning of wisdom is to get wisdom, and though it cost all you have, get understanding." Though it cost all you have, get understanding. I think one of the most valuable tools in our relationships, yet one of the things that we tend to undervalue, is understanding. Is understanding each other and where each other's coming from. I've seen tons of relationships ripped apart over a misunderstanding. I've had relationships messed up over a misunderstanding. I recall a time when I was in high school. I'm not going to tell y'all what I said because not that it's not appropriate in church. I just, y'all ask me later and I'll tell y'all later. But there's a friend of mine, and I made a comment to him as a joke. Because, we all kind of joke around as friends about different things. And I felt like he could take it. He knew my heart. He knew I wasn't really serious when I said it. And so I made a comment to him that was a joke. But he didn't take it as a joke. He really took heart to it, like it was serious. And I told him, even after I made the comment, I said, "No, man, I'm just kidding." He said, "That wasn't funny, man. That wasn't funny." And I thought he was playing around. I said, "No, dude, I'm serious. I'm kidding. I didn't mean that. It was just a joke." He said, "That wasn't funny." And can I tell you that from that day on, our relationship was over. I don't think he ever really forgave me. Though I asked for his forgiveness, I told him I was sorry. Though I tried to be positive and give him encouraging words, the next few weeks, nothing was going to change that. That misunderstanding, he didn't understand my heart. He took it out of context. Maybe I shouldn't have said it. That probably was part of my fault too. But the whole misunderstanding caused that relationship to end. And I think one of the most valuable things we can obtain in our relationships is understanding. And it really starts with communication, doesn't it? Stephen Covey, if you've ever read the book 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, he says this comment, I think it's in that book. He says, most people don't listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. Think about that. Most people don't listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. How many of you know somebody who it's hard to get a word in edgewise? Y'all don't want to raise your hand because the person sitting beside you, is that what it is? I better not, Pastor. You trying to get me in trouble? You know, some people, it's just hard to get a word in. And as they're talking, you have something you want to say, but they just keep talking. And then you got to wait until they end. And they change the course of the conversation, but you're really at that point not even listening to try to understand where they're coming from. Because you go all the way back to what your reply was at the very beginning of the conversation, because we don't always listen with the intent to understand, though it will do us good. It would do us good to be an ear that says, you know, I'm not going to try to reply until I know exactly what you're going through and I can see things through your lenses. Let's look at the misunderstanding in Joshua chapter 22. This could have been huge, but thankfully there was a decision made that changed the course of this. In Joshua chapter 22, we're going to look at verses 10 through 13, and then we're going to skip ahead. Joshua 22 verse 10 says, while they were still in Canaan, and when they came to a place called Gilgal, near the Jordan River, the men of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh stopped to build a large and imposing altar. So they stopped to build this large and imposing altar. Now the rest of Israel heard that the people of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh had built an altar at Gilgal, at the edge of the land of Canaan, on the west side of the Jordan. So the whole community of Israel gathered at Shiloh and prepared to go to war against them. This is serious. First, however, they sent a delegation led by Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the priest, to talk with the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. And this delegation comes to those three tribes, and they say, look, what are y'all doing? Why are y'all building this altar as a sign of rebellion? Because they thought they were building the altar for themselves so they can rebel against God. And they remind them about all the sins that has been brought, or all the destruction that's been brought on Egypt because of the sin of rebellion. And they accused them of something that really Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh had never intended on doing. And if you look at verse number 26, when they begin to explain, Reuben and the tribes, they give their defense of why they're building this altar. They said, we decided to build the altar not for burnt offerings or sacrifices, but as a memorial. It will remind our descendants and your descendants that we too have the right to worship the Lord at His sanctuary with our burnt offerings, sacrifices, and peace offerings. Then your descendants will not be able to say to ours that you have no claim to the Lord. If they say this, then our descendants can reply, look at this copy of the Lord's altar that our ancestors made. It is not for burnt offering sacrifices. It is a reminder of the relationship both of us have with the Lord. Far be it from us to rebel against the Lord or turn away from Him by building our own altar for burnt offerings, grain offerings, or sacrifices. Only the altar of the Lord our God that stands in front of the tabernacle may be used for that purpose. And check out verse 30. When Phinehas the priest and the leaders of the community, the heads of the clans of Israel, heard this from the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, what does it say? They were satisfied. Oh, okay. Oh, I'm glad I didn't jump to a conclusion then. Verse number 33 says all the Israelites were satisfied and they praised God and they spoke no more of war against Reuben and Gad. Can you imagine if they didn't first seek to get understanding what would have happened? They were prepared for war. How dare they build an altar in rebellion against God? They are against God, therefore they are against us. Let's fight them. But first, let's go talk to them. Good idea. We're glad you talked to them. Because if you wouldn't have sent the delegation to talk to them to get understanding, you would have caused an unnecessary war. And I think that's good advice for all of us in our lives, isn't it? That sometimes we just have to confront the people to seek the understanding before we go to war. with that person. One of our core values here at Restoration Point is honest communication. We just shared that a few weeks ago. And what that means is we know that there's going to be some misunderstandings. We can't avoid misunderstandings in life. But we're going to limit that as much as possible by trying to create a safe environment to where we all can just share our true feelings and love each other through that. I think there's something so valuable in having that honest communication and seeking understanding. Because here in going back to Genesis, you don't have that understanding. You don't have that communication. Potiphar's wife says one thing, and Potiphar, just before he even tries to test it, he goes off what she says, and all of a sudden he's throwing somebody in prison that doesn't deserve to be in prison. And it's this misunderstanding. Now, there's some misunderstandings in life that we can clear up, right? We can clear up by simply having a conversation. But I'm not going to be naive to believe that every misunderstanding you have in life can be cleared up with a simple conversation. I understand there are some people out there who are committed to misunderstanding you. I get that. I know there are. I think Potiphar was committed to misunderstanding Joseph. Joseph, it don't matter what you say, what kind of evidence you present. My wife said this, so you're guilty. Because I'm going to take my wife's side over your side. So how do we deal with these enemies in life that are a result of our misunderstandings? I'm glad you asked that question. Let's look at a few scriptures here that's gonna help us. And these things are not challenging, are not easy. They're challenging, but they're for our benefit. And keep in mind as we keep going here, we're going to get to some good stuff. Number one, if you're taking notes, how do I respond to my enemies? You ready for this? Love them and pray for them. Love them and pray for them. And you know, as difficult as that is, let me just tell you, I didn't make that up. That's not my rule, it's God's rule. Let's look at Matthew 5:43 through 45. You have heard the law that says, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. In that way, you will be acting as true children of your Father in heaven. The very words of Jesus. You've heard it said to hate your enemy, but I tell you, love and pray for those who persecute you. So that's the first thing we can do, is love and pray for them. The second thing we can do is feed them, and not laced with arsenic or anything like that. You know, feed them good stuff. Romans 12:20 simply says, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they're thirsty, give them something to drink. In doing this, you'll heap burning coals of shame on their heads. And y'all said, I like that part. I like that burning coals part. Feed them. Feed them. Feed your enemies. What's the third thing? It says, this one, I'm going to say the third thing is wish them the best. Wish them the best. That sounds really crazy, but listen to Proverbs 24, verses 17 and 18. Don't rejoice when your enemies fall. Don't be happy when they stumble. For the Lord will be displeased with you, and you will turn his anger away from them. So in other words, don't be happy when they fall down. Wish them the best. Hope they succeed. Whew, that's hard. That was hard for me to even say that. Hope they succeed. Ouch. Are you sure, Lord? Yeah, okay, that was what he said. There's three things. Pray for them. Love them. Feed them. Wish them the best. These are all very challenging. They're not easy for us at all. But if we don't do those things, then what kind of person will that make us? Because listen, we can't control what our enemies do to us, but we can control what they do in us. Big difference. Can't control what they do. They're going to say what they're going to say. They're going to do what they're going to do. We cannot control those things that they do, but we can control what happens inside of us and what we do with those things. That's what we can control. I like how one person put it. I don't have who gave this quote, but I've heard it, and I always got a kick out of it. It says, don't argue with a fool, because they'll only bring you down to their level and beat you with experience. Y'all heard that before? Don't argue with a fool. They'll bring you down to their level, beat you with experience, and there you are, looking like a fool with them, right? And it's bad to lose. It's one thing to be a fool. It's another thing to be a losing fool. That's even worse. So there again, what will they do in us? I think we need to understand that our enemies can be a source of value in our life. They can be very valuable. Because one thing, I'm pretty sure that all of us can agree that our enemies will make us pray harder, won't they? They'll make you pray harder. Your enemies will give you focus that you didn't know you had. Especially when they said, you will never. You say, just watch me. I will. Doggone it. Focus, right? You got focus. Had they not said anything, you wouldn't have focused as much. And another thing they do is, I believe, they propel you into what God's purpose is. And you say, Pastor, that don't sound right. It don't have to sound right because but it is right, because that's what happened with Joseph. His brothers sold him into slavery. They put him in a pit, sold him into slavery, and through that act of betrayal, he finds himself on the way with the Midianites that will eventually be sold into Egypt. He finds himself going to where God wants him to be, and it happened because of what his brothers did to him. He couldn't stay where he was. He had to get to Egypt, and that's how God used that situation. God propelled him through his brothers. Look at Jesus. In the garden, Judas came and betrayed Jesus with a kiss. And it was that act of betrayal through that enemy that fast-tracked Jesus to the cross. And even though the cross wasn't a fun experience for him, it was all for God's glory. It was all for our benefit. But it happened at the hands of an enemy. God didn't bring your enemy in your life. God doesn't bring our enemies, but you better believe that He'll use your enemies. He'll use them. He doesn't bring them, but He'll use them. He doesn't create it, but He controls it. If there's a fire in your house, I'm pretty sure you're probably going to be contacting the fire department or somebody on your behalf, right? Because the fireman's job is to control the fire, to handle the fire, right? When the firemen arrive on the scene, how many of you would point a finger in their face and say, "Why did you do this?" You would never do that, because you know the firemen didn't create the fire, they just control the fire. And if we can make that distinction between a fire in our lives, then why can't we make that same distinction in our lives whenever we get attacked by the enemy? Why do we all of a sudden blame God for it? Why do we say, "God, why did you do this? Why did you allow this?" Well, He's not the one that created it. He's not the one that brought it on, but He can control it. Just as He controlled Job's life when Satan tried to come against Job. And at first he said, "You can't touch his body." And then finally Satan said, "Well, you know, the reason he worships you is because he has his health. You let me touch his body and he'll curse you to your face." And God says, "Okay, you can do what you want to, but you can't kill him." He didn't create it. He didn't send Satan. He didn't call Satan up and say, "Hey, why don't you go pick on Job for a little bit? Let's test this boy." He didn't send him, no. But he controls him. And He used what happened to bring about really a double portion in Job's life. That's what the Bible says, that he was blessed doubly there at the end of that passage. And it's really, it all goes back to Romans 8:28. Y'all know that scripture? It says, "The good things in life all work together for the good." No, it says, this version says everything. And that NIV says all things work together for good to those who love God and those who are called according to His purpose. All these things work together for the good. Hebrews 12:2, I didn't give them that scripture, but it tells us to fix our eyes on Jesus, who for the joy of the cross that was set before Him, he endured the cross. He was able to endure the cross because He saw the joy that was set before Him. And the question I have for all of us this morning is, can we keep our eyes fixed on the presence of God while we're in the presence of our enemies? Can we keep our eyes fixed on the presence of God while we're in the presence of our enemies? Psalm chapter 23. Joey, you can go ahead and set that table. And I'll move over a little bit to give you some space. As Joey is setting this up, Psalm chapter 23, verse 5. Y'all know the 23rd Psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," yada, yada, yada. In verse number 5, he says, "You prepare a feast for me in the presence of my enemies." I think one version says, "You prepare a table for me in the presence of my enemies." He sets the table. Okay, you got that good. That one's a little bit broke. So I was going to give you a little tip, but you got it. So this is the table that is being set. And I'm going to have these guys get some chairs. And I'm going to ask the worship team to come. So I'm going to have them come up here in a moment anyway. Y'all are going to help me with this illustration. Okay, perfect. 4 of y'all. That's what I need. Come on, Chelsea. Where you going? Oh, okay. One of y'all, both of y'all, we can add a chair. Hey, we can add enemies. If we got to add one more enemy, we can add one more enemy. All right. Okay, who should we make Jesus in this story? Chris, we'll let you be Jesus. Or God. So Chris, I want you to have a seat right here. Valerie, come on up here. You DA and Dustin, come up here in front. Because y'all are my enemies. It's sitting right that my wife has to play this role. Enemies come in different shapes and sizes. Some enemies are your past. So this enemy right here is an enemy that's always going to tell you about what you did. They won't let go of what you did in the past. They're going to remind you of your past. That's what the Satan does. He's the accuser of the brethren. So you're the enemy. You're like the ghost of Christmas past. The enemy that reminds me of the past. So have a seat at the table, enemy that reminds me of my past. This enemy is going to remind me about how I ain't going to do nothing in the future. How you know, I'm worthless. I'm useless. God will never use me. I will never amount to anything. He's just going to really just do my future. So go ahead and have a seat at the table, enemy. And this enemy right here, it's a cute enemy. This enemy, I don't even want to call her an enemy. She's a friend of me. She's a friend of me. This enemy is it's kind of funny that I ended up with you. Is going to talk about my family. And that's got kind of strange because we are family. But she's going to talk about my kids. And she's going to talk about my wife, even though she is my wife. And she's going to make all these comments. And how many of you know that's the worst kind of enemy? The ones that bring your family into it. I can handle when people talk about me, but you're going to talk about my family. So you have a seat right there at the table, enemy. And so here's the deal. The Lord has prepared a table in the presence of my enemies. And I sit down, and I don't know if you guys have ever sat down at a table and with a large group party like this. And typically, if you sat down in this way, I'm probably not going to have many conversations with the person on the other end of the table, am I? I mean, do you guys typically have conversations with, hey man, how you doing over there? Because it's so far, when you sit down, usually your conversations revolve around this person or this person, maybe this person. You kind of keep it right here. You got this conversation going, they got their conversation going. Y'all know what I'm talking about? It's hard to have a conversation with that person down there. And this is the image I want you to see when God sets the table for us. As He's sitting at that end, we're sitting at this end, and it's in the presence of our enemies. So my enemies right here, they're wanting to have a conversation with me. They're wanting to engage me in this conversation. They're wanting to try to draw me in. And I can get drawn in, but what we need to do as Christians is not to get drawn into what kind of conversation they want to have with us. We need to focus our conversation on this man right here at the end of the table. Instead of focusing on them and letting them engage us, let's engage him no matter how difficult it might be. We have to push through some of the chatter that's going on. But I found this in life, that the more time we spend talking to him about them, then the more time we'll be able to focus on what he's doing rather than what they're doing. I'm going to say that again. The more time we spend talking to him about them. This is why it's so valuable when Jesus says, love your enemies. Pray for your enemies. I know it's hard, but he's saying the reason I want you to do that, because the more time you spend talking to me about them, you'll focus more on what I'm doing rather than on what they're doing. That's the difference. And as let me go back to my notes here to make sure I don't leave anything out. Y'all stay seated for a second. Because I'm going to come down here to God. I say you're God, you're Jesus. You're really whoever we need you to be, aren't you? Chris is such a versatile character. He'll just become whoever. And so here he is sitting at the table. Sit there right there. I said, don't look at my notes. Look away. Look away. If you see me walking by and the tears are in my eyes, look away, Chris, look away. I just had to throw a song in there. I just had to, guys. Y'all know me. I just had to. So here it is. If we're focusing on what he's doing, see, the enemy's plan is really, he wants us to forget about what he's doing. He wants to say, well look at what Dustin's saying about you. Look at what D.A. did to you last week. Look at what Valerie is saying over here. The more he can get you to focus on what they're doing and what they're saying, the less time you are focusing on what he's doing and what he's saying. And that's a win for the enemy. It's called the method of distraction, and that is a win for him. But you know what? Jesus modeled this perfectly. Because he didn't focus on what the enemy was doing when they were whipping him with that cat of nine tails. He didn't focus on what the enemy was doing when they were yelling, crucify him. He didn't focus on what the enemy was doing when they were spitting on him and hitting him, when they were putting a crown of thorns on his head, when they nailed him to the cross. He wasn't focused on what the enemy was doing. He was focused on what God was doing. That's why in Luke chapter 23, verse 24, he can hang on a cross and he can say, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. He wasn't focused on what they're doing. Father, forgive them because they don't know what they're doing. I'm not focused on what they're doing. I'm focused on what you're doing. And we would do good to do the same way. I love the fact that here at this table, in the presence of my enemies, God decides to serve me up some food. I love that God decides to feed me. He decides to nourish me. He decides to provide for me. Not over here in the corner. I ain't got to get away from it. I could be right smack dab in the middle of it and still get fed by God. And still find my nourishment from Him. Because my eyes are on Him. And I ain't paying attention. Y'all, thank you for that. Worship team, you guys can go ahead and take your spots. Thou preparest a table for me in the presence of my enemies. And if you're like me, you might say, God, I don't really like that passage. Say, God, in the presence of my enemies, God, I would much rather you give me a life in the absence of my enemies. I would much rather you give me a life where I don't have to deal with my enemies. But let me make a very profound statement. It's not going to sound profound, but I'm going to explain it to you. You can have a life. Well, first off, you can't have a life with the presence of God and the absence of enemies. Can't have it. You can't have a life with the presence of God and the absence of enemies. Do you know why? Because the very fact that God's presence is in your life is going to create enemies. It's going to create enemies. That's why you can't have God's presence and the absence of enemies, because His presence will stir up some devils. His presence will create some enemies in your life. You can't have the absence of enemies. That's why Jesus said it this way in John 15:18. He said, if the world hates you, remember, it hated me first. So you're on the right track. It hated me first. He said it in John 14, I believe it was, that in this world we will have trouble. We will have trouble. And some of that trouble will come at the hands of people trying to destroy us. Some of that trouble will be caused by people. But we can have confidence in knowing that in the presence of our enemies, God will still choose to bless us. I love that He'll bless us there in the presence. Let's look at 1 Samuel 16 this morning. 1 Samuel 16 is the story where God sent Samuel to go anoint a king. God was done with Saul. His time was up. And Samuel comes to the house of Jesse, where God has led him to anoint one of Jesse's sons. And let's look at chapter 16 of 1 Samuel, verse number 6. When they arrived, Samuel took one look at Eliab and thought, surely this is the Lord's anointed. But the Lord said to Samuel, don't judge by his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Pay attention to verse 8. Then who? Jesse told his son Abinadab to step forward and walk in front of Samuel. But Samuel said, this is not the one the Lord has chosen. Next, Jesse, who? Jesse summoned Shimeah, but Samuel said, neither is this the one the Lord has chosen. In the same way, all 7 of Jesse's sons were presented to Samuel, but Samuel said to Jesse, the Lord has not chosen any of these. Hasn't chosen any. So you see, Jesse is trying to decide who he feels is the best fit for the job. He's looking at his sons. Okay, how about this one? No? Okay, let me see. Oh, not you. Not you. How about this one? And he's lining up his kids like that, based on who he feels like is the right fit for the job. But none of the 7 sons are the right fit. And Samuel says, "Are these all the sons you have?" And I can almost see the reluctance in Jesse's voice as he says, "They're still the youngest. But he is out in the fields watching the sheep and goats." The very fact that he said "but" tells me he don't think much about David. Because if not, he would have said, "Oh, they're still the youngest. Let me go get him. Let me go get him." No, he didn't say that. They're still the youngest, but he's out in the field. David wasn't even valuable enough to his own father to get invited to this little arrangement. Wasn't even thought of as someone who could handle the crown. Let's not even waste our time on David. David ain't gonna be king. That boy will never be king. He'll never amount to anything. All he's good for is watching sheep. Let's not even invite him. But Samuel said, "Send for him at once. We won't sit down until he arrives." And after he gets there, I love verse 13. Ooh, I love verse 13. "So as David stood there among his brothers, Samuel took the flask of olive oil, and he brought and anointed David with oil, and the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David from that day on. And then Samuel returned to Ramah." After this, David was anointed where? In the presence of his brothers. Right there in the presence of his dad and his brothers. Wasn't even thought of to even invite to this event that they're having. But there in the midst of all that, God says, in the midst of all your enemies, I'm going to anoint you to be King David. I'm going to anoint you. You are the chosen one, David. In the presence of people who don't think you're good enough. In the presence of people who don't think you're smart enough. In the presence of people who don't think you have the skills or the talents necessary to do the job. In the presence of people, get this, who are more qualified than you. All of Jesse's sons were more qualified. That's why Jesse brought them up. In the presence of people who are more qualified than you, God will choose to bless you. He will choose to bless you. And you might want a life outside of enemies, but God's wanting to bless you in the presence of your enemies. And we say, "God, can't you just remove the enemies from my life? Can't you just take them away from me?" And God says, "No, I can't take them away from you because I'm trying to reveal who I am to them through you. That's why I can't take them away from you. I can't take them away because I have to show who I am in their lives." So in other words, Daniel, I got to watch you get thrown in the lion's den, Daniel, so I can show who I am to all those people. I got to watch you get thrown in the fire, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, so I can show who I am to King Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel, I got to watch you thrown in that pit. I got to watch you get falsely accused. I got to watch, or Joseph, I got to watch you get thrown into prison. I got to watch you in all those moments. Can't you just get rid of my enemies? No, I can't, because in the end, I'm going to show who I am through your life. So I have to watch you through all those attacks. I have to watch you through all those steps. I have to watch you through the presence of your enemies. That's why going back to that first verse, God is with us is the most important promise we can hold on to. Because knowing He's with us knows that He'll bless us in the presence of our enemies. And sometimes we need enemies around us so God can bless us despite what they've tried to do to stop you. So God can show Himself as extraordinary when all they saw was ordinary in your life and in who He was. So let's not kick our enemies to the curb. Let's not devalue what they do in our lives. Let's pull up a seat at the table and let's say, "God, I got enemies. I got lots of enemies. They don't think I can make it. They've said some things. They've done some things. I'm not going to run from them. I'm not going to hide from them. I'm going to sit right there in their presence. And I'm going to focus on you. Serve me up, Jesus. Let me get my eyes and my attention on you so I can forget about what they're saying and what they're doing. God, bless me in the presence of my enemies. Bless me in the presence of my enemies." God, we love you this morning.